And I'll just say it was difficult to create a slide deck about the work that El Tímpano has done for and with our community since the pandemic. There is just so much to share and say about it. So apologies if this is a little bit all over the place. But I want to start with just a brief background for those who aren't familiar with El Tímpano. Our mission is to inform, engage, and amplify the voices of Oakland's Latino and Mayan immigrant communities. We really started through a community-centered design process in talking to dozens of community leaders and hundreds of immigrant residents to really hear what they want in Spanish language media. And all of our strategies, our distribution strategies, editorial priorities, engagement strategies are really shaped by what we heard from the communities that we're striving to reach and serve. And so some of what that looks like is a community microphone that we take throughout the community, invite people to step up and share their story while we share with them information and resources on relevant local issues. Our second approach, and what we've really expanded, particularly since the pandemic, is a Spanish language SMS participatory reporting platform. And so every week, subscribers receive usually 2 messages per week, each focused on one particular issue that our community has told us is important to them. And they're invited to write back with, what questions do you have about this issue? How have you been affected by this issue? So it's very participatory. And finally, the final way that we achieve our mission is to amplify the voices of the communities that we serve and produce in-depth investigative reporting, all of which really emerges from what we're hearing from our community. Yes, I think I have a few more examples of that later, but what you see right here is just one example. We've, in partnership with the news outlet, The Oakland Side, we've published a series of first-person narratives of Latino and Mayan immigrants, just sharing essentially what the pandemic has been like for them. And so this is kind of our model in a nutshell, kind of taking the lens, taking a wider lens. I think this is really what distinguishes El Tímpano from a traditional news outlet that might start with a news team, a publication platform, and then really work on its audience and audience engagement strategy. We've really developed it in an inverse way by really investing in listening to and building trusting relationships with the communities that we seek to serve. Services and products they designed to address their information needs. And then through that, that level of trust and a reciprocal relationship that we have with our community, we produce impactful journalism. And all of this is really integral to how El Tímpano has been able to respond to our community's needs, particularly since the pandemic. And so the pandemic hit early last year. And, one thing that we saw immediately is something that we had outlined as a part of our information needs assessment process, which was that in the event of a crisis, the lack of a central trusted source for news threatens the ability to respond to emergency situations. It is impossible to overstate the impact that the devastation of the pandemic on the communities that El Tímpano serves. Latino immigrants have had 3 times the rates of COVID-19 than pretty much all other groups here in the region. When it comes to Indigenous Mayans, they've had even higher rates. Job losses, income losses. We actually just heard from someone yesterday who said he hasn't been able to pay rent for a year. And so we've really worked to address the pandemic in a number of ways. One is by expanding our SMS audience, because we consistently hear that from our audience that they're not getting this sort of information from any other source. So we wanted to make sure that more people have access to, the most timely and reliable public health and other public service information as they navigate the pandemic. We wanted to deepen local partnerships so that we can help connect people with other community assets that can, help them apply for rent relief or that are organizing food distributions or mutual aid initiatives. We wanted to expand our impactful journalism and make sure that those who are most impacted by the pandemic are reflected in the stories and coverage of the pandemic. And we've worked to combat misinformation. So this is kind of what that looks like. I believe my colleague, Vanessa, may be on the call. You see her in the lower right here. Vanessa has been the primary person interacting with our community via SMS and also conducting a lot of our in-person outreach. Our audience has more than quadrupled since the start of the pandemic. It's now nearing 10% of Oakland's Spanish-speaking households, and we estimate that it's approximately 40% Indigenous Mayan and 60% Latino immigrant. And it is a highly engaged audience. So over the course of the past year, a bit over 1 in every 2 subscribers has written into El Tímpano, whether that's to ask a question or to share a story, or the most common response that we get is simply, gracias por informarme. Thank you so much for keeping me informed. These are a few examples of those messages, obviously translated from Spanish. When, a big part of our work, particularly this spring, has been really helping people to navigate the vaccination process. And so once people were able to get vaccinated, we heard a lot of powerful, unsolicited testimony, just thanking us for helping them through that process. You also in here see a lot of the sort of stories that we've heard from our audience really indicating the vulnerability of low-income immigrants to abuse, whether that's workplace abuse or abuse as tenants. And that takes us then to the journalism that we produce to really, put more of a spotlight on those stories and to amplify the experiences and voices of the communities that we serve. So these are just a few examples. This one on the left is actually this probably was not in my submission packet for this award because this just came out last week. But El Tímpano was featured in a KQED podcast about the wave of displacement that El Tímpano has been reporting on from our community, despite the eviction moratorium. And these are cases that, aren't included in data on evictions because they're really unofficial evictions, primarily impacting undocumented immigrants. And the story in the middle, I think, is really interesting as it points out, it basically demonstrates how El Tímpano is both a public service to help inform Latino immigrants on public health issues and investigate and produce accountability journalism based on that engagement. And so after the holidays, or right around the holidays last year, we started getting messages from our audience saying, I just tested positive, but I haven't heard from any public health official. And I was told they would call me. And so we followed up and learned that, because of the post-holiday surge, there had essentially been a lapse of the protocols that the public health system had set up for contact tracing and resource provision. And so El Tímpano was instead, we were the ones providing people with information from the public health department in terms of what you should do, how you should quarantine. And we were able to link people up with officials in the public health department. But we also, produce a pretty in-depth story just about, that surge and what it meant for people who found themselves sick and pretty much in the dark about what to do. And I want to just close just with some thoughts on, what the pandemic has really illuminated to us as in thinking through our role as a community-centered news outlet, and that we want to produce journalism that provides vital information, particularly during a crisis. Also that one that, helps people connect to each other and connect to other local resources and services in their community. Something else that we've been thinking a lot about is, journalism for healing. How can journalism hold space for healing? And, something that I think Vanessa and I have reflected on as we receive so many messages from community members, even on a topic such as, sometimes we may do a call out on, where have you found strength during this difficult time? And people just really value the opportunity to reflect on that and to share that. Journalism for equitable coverage. How can we ensure that those at the center of the story are really reflected in how we're understanding that issue? And I didn't even get into our misinformation work, but, how can journalism be a resource to prevent and combat misinformation? And I'll close it at that, leave time for my colleague, but also happy to answer any questions or hear some feedback.